So starting with plot, essentially just in general terms, plot means what happened. If you read a story and you turn to a friend and tell them what happens in the story, meaning you assume they didn't read it, then you describing the start, middle, and end of the story is a type of plot. It's the order of events. But there's a little bit more to plot that Kelly Mays discusses in more detail in the reading, where you think about the order of events in the story and why they're told in that order and how they're told in that order. As a reader, you ask yourself, what will happen next? And how will this all turn out for all the characters? When analyzing plot, think more about the why and the how instead of what. If it helps, you think about what happens first, just the general summary of the story. But when you're analyzing, you have to kind of dig a little deeper. And when you think about why events happen and how they happen, meaning the order of the events, that gets you more to write about. So think about the word plot versus action. Events of a story is called action. So if you're talking to somebody and saying, the story starts this way, then this stuff happens, and this is how it ends. That's action. Action isn't really helpful when you're analyzing for plot. It doesn't really get you thinking past the surface level. So, thinking about how and why an author orders events is called plot. That is more important, the how and the why. Plot allows for more speculation and analysis. So a way to do that is to think about something called sequencing. And sequencing is the order to connect certain events. How is the story told, in what order, and how do the events all relate? That's analyzing for sequencing. There's different ways to tell a story. Traditional storytelling orders events from earliest in time to latest, meaning it goes in order. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, that's all linear and that's in order. If a story starts in 1950, then moves on to 1962, then ends in 1985, that's traditional storytelling order. That's called linear because it's in order. Fiction writers choose how they want to sequence their story. They have all the power, right? Because they're the creators. So do they want to tell it in this traditional storytelling or not? So there's different terminology that the book discusses. And you think about these when you're thinking about sequencing as well. To think about literary elements this week. So 3 of the ones we're looking at are plot, setting, and character. So this lecture is going to talk about plot and setting, and these are the page numbers that it mirrors in the textbook as well. So I recommend reading the pages first, then hopping over to this lecture. I also recommend that you download this PowerPoint to follow along because there's a few links that I reference if you want to click into them while you're reviewing this video. So that link is posted above this video file on Blackboard. So let's talk about plot and setting and what that means when you're reading elements of fiction. So starting with plot, essentially just in general terms, plot means what happened. If you read a story and you turn to a friend and tell them what happens in the story, meaning you assume they didn't read it, then you describing the start, middle, and end of the story is a type of plot. It's the order of events. But there's a little bit more to plot that Kelly Mays discusses in more detail in the reading, where you think about the order of events in the story and why they're told in that order and how they're told in that order. As a reader, you ask yourself, what will happen next? And how will this all turn out for all the characters? When analyzing plot, think more about the why and the how instead of what. If it helps, you think about what happens first, just the general summary of the story. But when you're analyzing, you have to kind of dig a little deeper. And when you think about why events happen and how they happen, meaning the order of the events, that gets you more to write about. So think about the word plot versus action. Events of a story is called action. So if you're talking to somebody and saying, the story starts this way, then this stuff happens, and this is how it ends. That's action. Action isn't really helpful when you're analyzing for plot. It doesn't really get you thinking past the surface level. So, thinking about how and why an author orders events is called plot. That is more important, the how and the why. Plot allows for more speculation and analysis. So a way to do that is to think about something called sequencing. And sequencing is the order to connect certain events. How is the story told, in what order, and how do the events all relate? That's analyzing for sequencing. There's different ways to tell a story. Traditional storytelling orders events from earliest in time to latest, meaning it goes in order. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, that's all linear and that's in order. If a story starts in 1950, then moves on to 1962, then ends in 1985, that's traditional storytelling order. That's called linear because it's in order. Fiction writers choose how they want to sequence their story. They have all the power, right? Because they're the creators. So do they want to tell it in this traditional storytelling or not? So there's different terminology that the book discusses. And you think about these when you're thinking about sequencing as well. So if you think about in media res, that means you're placed, boom, right in the middle of some kind of action that started. Then maybe the author takes you to something in the past and then something in the future. Flashbacks is where a character thinks back in time. Flash forwards is the story takes you to the future. And then foreshadowing is an event in the past that hints or predicts future outcomes in the story as well. So Kelly Mays really goes into that terminology as well in the reading. If there's a subplot, that means there's a side story in the same story, in the same fictional work. So there's a main story, and then if there's a subplot, it's something else happening, maybe with other characters, maybe with the main character still, but it's a side story. These subplots are used for various reasons. It could be to add depth to other characters. It could be to add dimensions to the main character. It could be almost a way to distract the audience maybe and try to make connections outside of the main story. But subplots could be used as well. So when you think about pacing is the duration, meaning the time the author gives to each event. What is their pacing? What time do they want to allow each event to be told and unfolded? Pacing allows the reader to analyze and focus on emphasis, effect, and meaning in the same way that we analyze sequence as well. So a term used in that reading is discriminated occasion. That's just where a story uses maybe transitional phrases or time frames, either to speed a story along or to really slow it down. So if you're following along with the PowerPoint and you click this blue link, if you're a SpongeBob fan, I am. I mean, I grew up with it, but that's what comes to mind when I think of that being used in fiction, in media, in more TV show type genres. But they have that narrator, if you know SpongeBob, right, where it says, 1 hour later, or 1 eternity later, or moments later, things like that. So this link is all the times it's been used in SpongeBob. But pacing is really effective. Where I notice it where certainly it speeds time up as well, like these transitional phrases do. But where I really notice pacing in stories is when something is slowed down. This could be noticed in suspense because when you're reading or watching something suspenseful, the pacing kind of slows because they want you to feel that stress that the characters are facing. Their heart is racing, time is standing still. So the author wants you to feel that emotion behind it. So that's where I really notice pacing is if one scene in a kitchen feels like it's years, but it's just one afternoon. That to me, slower pacing to me almost stands out a little bit more. Another thing I wanted to mention about sequencing that I neglected to bring up. Traditional storytelling, like I said, is from start to finish in order of time. But a lot of modern stories are told out of order, and they're told for a reason. So, for example, there's a documentary on Netflix that just came out about the Night Stalker. The Richard Ramirez, he was a serial killer. And this documentary was, if you haven't seen it, that's what it's about. It's about this serial killer called the Night Stalker and all the terror that he reigned in California, up and down California. But what I noticed is the creators of the documentary use sequencing in a really interesting way. Traditionally, if we're learning about, say, a serial killer, it starts with where they were born, what their upbringing was like, how their childhood was, how they were in high school, and then what first event led them to the becoming who they are, and then the victims, right? And then how they got caught or if they weren't caught. That's usually the traditional storytelling approach. What I noticed with this documentary that was really interesting is his name is not mentioned. I don't think it's mentioned until maybe the end of episode 2 or maybe even episode 3. They really tell it out of order where they start with the first victim, the second victim, the third victim, and they go in the order of the victims. But we don't know about him at all until episode 3. They really dive into it. And I feel that the documentary, the creators of it, chose that order for a reason. They want to focus on maybe the victims, the families, and also just they give you really great background information on the leading detectives on the case. In fact, we learn about them first before we even learn about the victims. So it's really interesting the way they tell that order because maybe so many people know about these serial killers or a quick Google search can help them figure out who they are, that they can tell it out of order and it's still very effective. So it's something I thought about that I wanted to bring up. Just with sequencing, think about why events are told in the order and the effects they have and what it would be like if it was told in order. If it's nonlinear and it was told in order, how would that be? Would it still be effective? Or if it's linear, would it be effective if it was nonlinear? So think about things like that. When we think about conflicts, this is really interesting to read about where a conflict is a struggle, right? In general, in life, some type of struggle. And hopefully some type of resolution. It may not be 100%, but there's some type of either hope to resolution or start to resolution or full resolution. If you think about, I put this one, just something from superhero movies, because traditionally action and adventure films and end with a hero, I need to fix that typo, sorry about that, end with the hero saving the world and defeating the villain, right? There's some kind of struggle between good versus evil. Hero comes in, solves the conflict, the world is saved. That's traditional conflict storytelling. But conflict doesn't have to be obvious. Characters can be against nature, natural forces, against fate, guiding them or going against them. Society against a character, societal expectations and norms that are negative. Or individuals with different perspectives. If one person has a belief on religion in one aspect and somebody has a different perspective on religion and they start to argue, that's a conflict as well. And it's external because it's between two different people. So those are all external forms of conflict. It's between two people with different perspectives. But internal conflicts are really interesting. and quite relatable, right? Because we are human beings. We are not perfect, so we have inner battles with ourselves. So inner conflicts are battles a character faces within them. It's only them. So maybe self-confidence issues, loving someone toxic who's bad for them, common logic, meaning the brain versus the desire of the heart, brain versus heart. Brain says one thing, heart says something else, etc. So here's a silly scene from an older movie, The Emperor's New Groove, where one of the characters, Kronk, is at an inner conflict with that silly devil angel on his shoulder. So that link represents inner conflict. So when we think about conflicts, there's a really excellent image, the Freytag's pyramid, in our book. And these bullet points describe that pyramid, but the book goes into much more detail of it, where there's 5 components of this pyramid that tell conflict in a full story. So it starts with exposition. That's where you learn about the characters, their situations in life, the time and place of the story, maybe just that kind of background information, often hints at maybe a potential conflict you're going to find out about, but it may not, just a little subtle hint. Then it moves on to the rising action. That is an action in the story that opens the conflict, meaning some kind of incident, some type of event puts us as the reader into that moment, and that situation changes and opens conflict. And the book also has really great examples of 2 quick little short stories that describe the conflicts. So it places you right into the moment of the conflict with the rising action. And that's the word, right? Rising. It's starting to rise into more and more conflict and issues these characters will face. Number 3 is climax, or also known as the turning point. It's the most intense emotional moment in the story. The outcome of the plot and the fate of the characters are decided here, which is kind of exciting. What are the turning points? It can be maybe a discovery a character has. If a character has an epiphany, and what an epiphany is they realize a truth, either about themselves or about their situation in the story, etc. So their fate is determined, maybe not, it's not officially solved or answered in the turning point, but it is realized. So it's very intense. Number 4 is the falling action. So it's the opposite of rising, right? Where then everything from the turning point, from the intense emotional aspect of the story, starts to fall. The release tension in the story. So it could be through a twist. It could be through some type of start to a resolution. Or anywhere in between as well. There's a phrase called deus ex machina, and that's a theater term, and it's where some type of God character appears from the ceiling and comes down to the characters and solves their human character issues. So there's some type of build to resolution finally in the falling action. And then conclusion, the story closes. Either the conflict that we read about is fully resolved and everybody's happy and jolly, there's a start to a resolution, or there's nothing has been solved, but some character has some type of closing thought. Characters are never the same, even if the story ends exactly how it starts. So when you reach a story's end, ask why it's different and how things are different for the characters and the story itself. So, if a character starts out being a horrible, bitter person and something very minimal happens to them where they may not change and become this perfect, heroic person and hero. It's almost unbelievable to think that way, right? Because people don't change off one little occurrence, usually. But just if they have a quick, brief second change of thought or perspective on something, they may go back to who they are. But the fact that they had that change, think about why they had that change. And that's evaluating the conflict resolution, and ending of a story. So that's overall thinking about plot. You think about how and why something happens. So when we think about setting, this part of the reading in the book is pretty short because setting usually is describing setting, at least what it is pretty straightforward. Setting is where and when a story takes place, meaning time as well. So the temporal setting, the plot time, and what that means is, the minutes in the day, the hours, the day itself, what year is it, what decade, centuries, things like that. But then also place. Sorry, my OCD is triggering there. Place, physical geographical location. Where does it take place? On a park bench, in a city, on another planet, in some evil vampire lair, etc. Any or all and in between. General setting helps us understand cultural context as well. If a story talks about the Civil War, about the year of 2020, the Great Depression, Victorian England, if there's any hints to that could also help us establish what's going on with the characters. Particular settings adapt with the actions of the story as well. So it could change. Maybe the story starts in June and then it ends in December. Setting isn't always the exact same time and location that a story starts. In fact, it usually doesn't. Even if it's a short story that starts over a span of 10 minutes, there was still some type of change. So we can move around, and there's particular settings that adapt with the actions of the story. So if it starts in June at a hotel in a spa, maybe it ends December in Denver, Colorado in a cabin. So there's always some kind of change with the setting. So when analyzing setting, it's tempting. I can relate to this too. Sometimes if a story is heavy in setting detail, I might scan over it, but you miss important details. I've learned too. Don't skim details with setting. It might be a way to hint at what's going on with the character and also the tone, meaning the emotion that you want to feel with the story. So think of it this way. If you're in a really good mood, you might pay attention maybe more to your surroundings. Maybe the sound, like for example, I like warm weather, and when it's warm outside and I'm in a good mood, I pay attention to the green grass. I feel the sun more on my skin. I pay attention to the animals outside. I just have a little bit more awareness of my environment. So these are called sensory details, and it helps us analyze the story. So we feel what the narrator feels. It's a way for the author to have you feel what the narrator is going through. By understanding a character's personality, because that's their personality, right? If they're having approaches to the environment, we're learning about their personality. Maybe they're moody, maybe they're a happy person in the moment, maybe they're excited about something, maybe they're anticipating an event, things like that. So by understanding their personality, we may be able to understand actions that follow, or just be able to relate a little bit more to analyze. So again, an example, if a story takes place, if they're mentioning something about a potential war, and you find out it's pre-Civil War South, we may be able to analyze character conflicts, maybe if they have certain ethics, if they're against certain ideals, and all that. We can learn and maybe even predict character actions and understand, meaning we don't maybe agree, but we understand why this character is written the way they're written. If a setting is almost non-existent, there are plenty of stories that I've read where I have no idea what the setting is. I don't know the year, I don't know the city, the state, I don't even know anything besides the fact that they live in a house maybe, and that's it. But if a setting is almost non-existent or very vague, meaning it's not detailed, it may be on purpose so that we can focus instead on dialogue, the conflicts of plot as discussed in this pyramid here, think about that, or just general emotion, meaning how the characters feel about situations, how they're describing the room or another character or an event, an action, or think about, it helps us analyze sequencing then, the order in which a story is told. So it might be on purpose. And there's also ways to still get a general, maybe even decade about when a story takes place. Think about what objects a character uses If there's no mention of a cell phone and a character has to run home to call their friend to tell him the news, then we know it's earlier than maybe even the 90s, maybe even the 80s, maybe it's in the 50s, where kids are carpooling to go to the diner and have a milkshake and listen to Elvis on the jukebox, things like that hint that maybe it's a certain decade, at least we can kind of gather. So just pay attention to little details like that, and that's analyzing set